in this gospel, there is manifested day in, day out, week in, week out, to be received by faith, building faith. There is a righteousness given to you that you cannot have on your own, and you stand on that and live by that.
It is really good news that there is a righteousness that guarantees our eternal joy. John Piper rejoices over that righteousness in Romans 1:17 in this episode of Light and Truth. This sermon was originally preached at Bethlehem Baptist Church on August 23, 1998.
There are only two great concerns in the world. One is the concern that God be properly displayed in the universe. And the other is the concern that you and I find everlasting joy in Him. These are the two great concerns of the universe. The display of the glory of God and everlasting contentment in Him. Now, what I saw in meditating afresh this week on these verses is that verse 16 addresses the second of those big concerns, and verse 17 addresses the first of those big concerns. Verse 16 says, I am not ashamed of the gospel, because it is the power of God for salvation. And that's what we want. Salvation means escape from wrath and judgment and the arrival in our lives of everlasting joy in the presence of Almighty God forever and ever and ever. We want that. That is one of the great concerns of the world. Can I live forever in heaven and happiness instead of in hell and misery? That is a huge concern. And the other one, verse 17 says, in it, that is in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, the righteous man shall live by faith. And so you see that central affirmation, something about God is revealed in the gospel. This is a God display. This is about God. So verse 16 is all about salvation by faith, and verse 17 is all about its foundation, a demonstration of something about God. So these are the big issues in the world. You might think that the scandal of the White House is a big issue. Henry VIII makes Bill Clinton look like a Puritan. And he's off the screen. A blip. Who remembers Henry VIII? Who cares about Henry VIII? Genghis Khan makes the bombings of the embassies and the reprisals look like a recess tussle. Whole peoples wiped off the scene in Central Asia. And who in this room can tell me what century Genghis Khan lived in? Let alone anything about his life. He does not matter. He is a goner. These are not the big issues. Those are not the big people. The big issues are the display of God and what becomes of us in eternity. That's the big issue in life. Whether anybody in the world recognizes it or not, once they turn off their television and be still and know that He is God, it will settle in. My God, I have devoted my life to many small things. Open my heart to the big issues in the world. The main point that I have been trying to develop is this. These two verses are not about how you become a believer, but how you get saved as a believer. That's been my thesis, because I think that's the point of verse 16. The gospel is the power of God unto salvation for all those who, and then this present tense, continuous action Greek word believe is so crucial. All those who go on believing. This verse is about how believers escape the wrath of God. The same present tense you can see there in verse 17. The gospel is the power of God unto salvation for everyone who believes, because in it the righteousness of God is being revealed, is the right nuance to that verse. It might help us to linger here for a minute on this future idea of salvation, because there is a reality of present and past salvation that we cherish. But in the book of Romans, this future idea of being saved is central. So go with me, if you would, to chapter 5, verse 9. The reason I want you to focus on chapter 5, verse 9 is because not only do we see here the futurity of salvation, but we see the very structure of verses 16 and 17. Verse 9 of chapter 5 is a restatement of the thesis of the letter found in verses 16 and 17 of chapter 1. Let me read it to you. Verse 9. Having now been justified by His blood, we shall be saved. Notice, future tense. We shall be saved from the wrath of God. That's the salvation of 1:16. Now, stick with me at verse 9 for just a minute. I want you to see something. Because if you get this, you will have Romans, and then all your reading in Romans will fit into this thesis. Verse 9 of chapter 5 is verses 16 and 17 of chapter 1 in flip-flopped order. So let me flip-flop the two halves of verse 9, read it slowly, and you think about verses 16 and 17, and then I'll compare them for you. Okay, flip-flopping the order of verse 9 goes like this. We shall be saved from the wrath of God through Christ, because we have been justified by His blood. That's exactly what verses 16 and 17 of chapter 1 says. Go back with me and see if you see it. Verse 16 says, the gospel is the power of God unto salvation. That's unto the escape of the wrath of God. Saved from the wrath of God for all who believe. And then comes the foundation. Because in it, a righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith. And we've spent weeks trying to defend the interpretation that the revelation of the righteousness of God there is the gift of righteousness to sinners to be received by faith, which chapter 5 verse 9 calls justification. I wonder if you've got it. I wonder if you see it. Paul means for you to understand this letter. He does not mean for you to come and get titillated by my language week in and week out. He means for the fabric of your brain to be woven through with the fabric of the thinking of this letter. There's a logic. I remember when I went to seminary in 1968, my whole head blew open at the top because I was simply shown that the apostles argue instead of stringing pearls together called verses. I didn't get it for 25 years or 22 years. I treated the Bible as pearls. Here's a verse pearl. Here's a verse pearl. You need a pearl today? You need a bite today? Eat it. The Bible, especially Romans, not every book is the same. Don't mean to smooth it all out and say there are no stories. But you take a book like Romans. I want to preach the gospel to you who are in Rome because I am not ashamed of the gospel, because it is the power of God unto salvation, because in it the righteousness of God is revealed, because righteousness and wrath are being poured out from God. He means for you to get that. Please don't be passive listeners. Please don't take my word for it. Please don't just come for a little nugget on Sunday morning. Please turn on your God-given brain and get into Romans. So I'm going to say it again. Chapter 5, verse 9, in reverse order, says you're going to be saved in the future from the wrath of God by Christ because, come down under it, because you have been justified by His blood. Now go to 16 and 17. And 16 says, the gospel is the power of God unto that salvation for everybody who believes. And then come under it and put this massive foundation of the righteousness of God or the justification. Put it underneath and it says, because in this gospel there is manifested day in, day out, week in, week out, to be received by faith, building faith. There is a righteousness given to you that you cannot have on your own, and you stand on that and live by that. Now, here we are at the quotation from Habakkuk 2:4 at the end of verse 17. And what I just said, I believe, is why he quoted this verse. Let's read it in context. In the gospel, the righteousness of God is being revealed from faith to faith. So the righteousness of God as a gift to be received by faith. This is called justification. And now he quotes Habakkuk 2:4. As it is written, but the righteous man shall live by faith. Now I want you to see the point of this quote, its meaning and its relevance in these two verses. So you don't need to go back with me to Habakkuk, but I'm going to linger on Habakkuk for a minute. I love the book of Habakkuk. It has a little place in my marriage that is very special. Because when you come to the end of this devastating story of the wrath of God poured out on the nations and upon Judea, and it looks like there's no hope for anybody, you have these unbelievably magnificent words about though there be no sheep in the stall, and though there be no grapes on the vine, and though there be no corn in the field. In other words, though I be absolutely destitute, nevertheless I will rejoice in my God. We read that at our wedding. That's why it's special for us. We didn't expect an easy life. We didn't expect an easy marriage. We were very aware of how different we are. And it hasn't been easy. And child rearing is not easy. And cancer is not easy, which one of these days, or something like it, will take one of us. And at our funeral, whoever goes first will hear it again. Though there be nothing but God, we will rejoice. So I love this book. And so I have lingered long over it this week, trying to understand this verse in the context of Habakkuk. Now here's the context. God is very angry at the nations, and He's angry at Judah, the tribes that are left after the devastation of Assyria has taken the northern tribes away. And in chapter 1, verses 5 and 6, He declares what's coming. Be astonished, wonder, I am doing something in your days you would not believe if you were told. For behold, I am raising up the Chaldeans, this is Babylon, that fierce and impetuous people who march throughout the earth to seize dwelling places which are not theirs. Now that raises a huge problem for the listeners to this prophet Habakkuk in Judah. What would you say if you heard he's releasing the Chaldeans to do his judgment on the earth, including his own people? What would you say to this prophet? What I would say is there any way to escape the wrath of God? That's what I would say. And the answer comes in verse 4 of chapter 2, which is the one that Paul quotes. He says, "Behold, as for the proud, his soul is not right within him, but the righteous will live." That is, will gain his life, be saved from the wrath of God by his faith. Now, there are two ways that this quote is relevant for this context in Romans 1:16 and 17. Let's take them one at a time. Number one, it's relevant because it says, rescue from the judgment of God depends on faith. It's by faith, he says, that you're going to gain your life. It's by faith that you're not going to be swept away in the judgment utterly by these Babylonians. It's by faith that you will live. And so the word live, you see that at the end of verse 17 now. The righteous will live by faith corresponds to salvation in verse 16. If you don't get that connection, you'll probably make hash out of these verses. Verse 16 says, the gospel is the power of God unto salvation, unto life, unto escape from wrath. And then at the end of verse 17, he brings in a supporting Old Testament text that says, when the Chaldeans are coming and God is angry and you ask, where can there be rescue? Where can I gain my life? Where can there be salvation? The answer is by faith. And so the text supports faith as the way to be saved. That's the first connection between 17 and 16 and the quotation of this verse. Here's the second connection. This verse, Habakkuk 2:4, quoted at the end there, verse 17, says, it was a righteous person. Underline righteous now. We're going to deal with this one. It was a righteous person who gains his life by faith. The righteous, the person who is righteous, will believe and therefore live. Now, we must be very careful here. I do not want to read in to Habakkuk what is taught by Paul just because it's taught by Paul and may not be there in Habakkuk. So as I ponder this, I do not think Habakkuk in verse 4 of chapter 2 is explicitly teaching that the person is righteous by faith. I don't think he's teaching that. But Paul is teaching that. The gift of righteousness in verse 17 is justification, and it is revealed to faith. So justification by faith, having a right standing, being righteous before God by faith is what verse 17 is teaching. So in bringing verse 4 of Habakkuk 2 under to support it, is he doing something illegitimate with the Old Testament? That's what a lot of people wrestle with. Now here's where it really pays off to take hours to meditate on the Old Testament context of Paul's use of it. How quick contemporary scholars are to say, Paul plays fast and loose with the Old Testament. He makes it mean all kinds of crazy things it never meant and uses it to support his purposes that it never meant to support. Well, I've been working at this for about 30 years now, and frankly, I trust Paul more than any scholar I have ever met. He has won my confidence over and over and over again in these things.
This is Light and Truth, God-centered preaching to help you see Christ clearly and treasure Him truly. I'm your host, Dan Kruver. Thank you for listening. On our next episode, John Piper continues our series on the Gospel's good news with a sermon titled, Righteousness Revealed Through Faith. I hope you'll join us. For more resources, visit desiringgod.org.